Baroque architectural style was present between 1600 and 1830. It's a direct evolution of Renaissance architectural style. And there's one thing that changed culturally that allowed the style to develop. The style was basically a comeback to a religious aspects of architecture, and it's pretty present in terms of how the style is representing the richness of the environments and the glorification of the culture of religious culture. There's a few things that basically define Baroque architectural style. First thing is complicated and irregular shapes as well as asymmetry. And when we look at some of the examples, those complicated shapes and asymmetry are basically present when we have sculptures and we look at sculptures that are basically almost overwhelming the whole environment. This is a great example. This is a Karlskirche in Vienna, and it's the altar of Karlskirche, and you can see how prominent the sculpture, the religious sculptures are here in this environment. And you can see how much of a space they are taking. Obviously, we have some symmetry in terms of the construction itself, because it's much easier to build with the symmetry in mind. However, you can see that we have a lot of those sculptures that basically bring that asymmetry and change the way we perceive the environment overall. When we look at the exterior parts, you can see that it's very similar situation. This example is again Karlskirche in Vienna, and you can see that although there's a symmetry to the construction itself, we still have a lot of sculptures that are pretty much decorating the whole environment, and there is some asymmetry going on. Obviously, symmetry will still prevail because it's how buildings are made and how architecture works. The more symmetry there is, the more the easier it is to construct. However, there is some more of an emphasis of that more complicated shapes, irregular shapes, less of a pure geometry, more of a complicated combined geometry of this architecture. Obviously, one of another aspects is twisted columns and high domes, and again, Karlskirche is a wonderful example of that, because you can see exactly that. You can see those twisted columns here. It's a totally fresh approach to how the columns are presented. You can see the high domes, the high main dome of the church itself right here. This is a great example of Baroque architecture is Versailles in France. Obviously, we can see how much emphasis of a sculpture is present in this architecture, but what's most impressive is the richness of the interior of that place, and that's one of the another aspects, is the amount of richness that the environment itself would have. You can see a lot of gold, crystal, and marble being used in order to create the environment, to create the interior of this environment, present how rich the religious culture is and how much of a praise towards religion this architectural style is supposed to bring. Another big aspect is amazing frescoes, large-scale frescoes on the ceiling, on the walls, and whatnot. And this is another great example. This fresco is a perfect example of that. Another one, which is probably the most popular, is this one. This one is called Sant Ignazio in Rome. So basically, you can see how deep this painting is. It almost feels like we're extending the architecture of this interior and everything is just painted in. There's basically half of it, half of the ceiling feels like it's much deeper, even though it's just being painted. But the realism and the amount of details we see here is just very impressive, and that's what Baroque architectural style would be about. How impressive it is, and how much is it trying to impress you, whether it's from the outside or the inside. So those are basically few of an examples. Again, this is St. Peter's Basilica baldachin created by Bernini, and this is another example of those twisted columns we've been talking about. And look at the richness and the amount of details we can see on those columns. This is exactly what is defining Baroque architecture style. Now, how you would use that in, say, a video game? There are many options. Again, I almost gonna repeat myself saying that creating a historical piece is an obvious choice. However, the closer we get to present times with the architecture, the more elaborated and more complicated the architecture becomes, the more of that we could use towards high fantasy or science fiction. And Baroque is a perfect example. It's a great architecture to be used for high fantasy, where we can have those really elaborated, complicated shapes, lots of sculptures, and just, you know, extend that and quantify that look into maybe much more ground scale constructions. That's one of the options. One of the great examples of video games that possibly you could use that style, or some of that video game series is actually using parts of that style, is Final Fantasy series. And again, any other high fantasy games could be a great example for this architectural style. Also, sci-fi. We could create almost like a royal family architecture style, and express the reality of that family, but build it around a very futuristic setting. So there's a lot of options to be used here, and I really love this architectural style because the amount of detail is just staggering, and it's just beautifully executed detail.